The smoke we're breathing in right now is these people's homes, it's their possessions, it's like everything they hold dear.
It's them. My guest today, Jamie Minden, is part of the leadership driving the 0 Hour movement forward. She's not here to talk about hope. She's here to talk about power, strategy, and how to turn a youth-led movement into measurable global environmental progress. How dangerous or how scary is it that we only wake up when it hits us individually?
You're right. It's not impacting everyone in the same way. And the people who have the most power to impact the climate crisis are people in the global north, people in the United States that are consuming and burning a huge amount of these fossil fuels. And we here in this country have been shielded from far more of the climate impacts than most of the rest of the world, most of the global south.
What do you do that ensures you guys don't sell out, for lack of any other word, and actually go for the policy? Because that's the ultimate goal. If we can't change policy or make policy, the rest is hopeless.
And don't get me wrong, I am such a big fan of all of the climate movements that are organizing today. But I do think, unfortunately, there was a very toxic kind of mentality that kind of worked its way into the movement where, young people were really strategic in moving the needle forward on climate change during that time. We have, in recent years, especially since the pandemic, invested a lot of our time and energy into policy. We were able to change policy. I was able to change local level policy, just by showing up as a kid in city council meetings. It really makes people stand up and pay attention. We need to stand up now before it's too late.
Welcome to Compassiviste Dialogues. I'm your host, Ali Horiad. My goal in this program is to educate our audience about various global issues and how we can help. My guest today, Jamie Minden, is part of the leadership driving the 0 Hour movement forward. She's not here to talk about hope. She's here to talk about power, strategy, and how to turn a youth-led movement into measurable global environmental progress. 0 Hour was born out of frustration, just like all good things start. The kind that comes from watching decision makers talk about climate change while the planet's clock keeps ticking. Founded and led by youth, 0 Hour has built a movement that blends education, advocacy, and direct action to demand urgent environmental policy shifts. They've organized marches in major cities, built global partnerships, and trained a generation of young people to become climate leaders in their communities. 0 Hour has grown from a small youth-led initiative to an internationally recognized force, proving young leaders can set the agenda on climate, not just join the conversation. So, hello, Jamie, and welcome to Compassiviste Dialogues.
Hi, Ali. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Let me start with your personal story. When did climate change, I guess in your generation, it's always been the news. So from the time you can remember, you've always heard something in the headlines about climate change. It's not like you're, 80 and it's something that dawned upon you when you were 40. And so tell me, when did this start for you? That climate change stopped becoming a news headline and became something you felt you had no choice but to do something about. It's not like, you could have been an engineer or a doctor and you chose engineering. This is life or death.
Yeah, you put that really well. Well, as you said, it's definitely something I grew up with seeing as a reality. So I'm from the Bay Area in California, and where I grew up, there was a pretty severe drought that started kind of a couple of years before I was born. And so, maybe as a little kid, I wasn't aware of, the environmental impacts around me. But growing up, I had this kind of dichotomy where I loved the nature around me. I loved the community I grew up in. I was really lucky to grow up around beautiful redwoods and tide pools in the ocean, and have a really caring, group of adults and young people around me who were, educating me and raising me well. But at the same time, I started seeing, as I, came of age and became aware of these things, I started seeing the impacts that the drought was having on the place that I lived in and loved. Um, and I started to get progressively, as you said, angrier as I grew up. Seeing that this was an issue that was so visually obvious, like just looking out the window, you can tell the impacts of the drought in our community. And yet, I saw such consistent lack of action from those in power, from adults who seemed to have more power than me in that moment. And I remember feeling like I'm pretty, angsty middle schooler, angsty teenager. And, just feeling that anger and that frustration, talking to folks who were supposed to have the answers and seeing them, just kind of lie to me and say, oh, everything will be okay. And like when I knew it wasn't going to be. And so by the time I got to high school, I had sort of started organizing already a little bit, just because of the impacts of the drought in my community and because of that frustration I was feeling. But the climate crisis really hit home for me when Paradise, California was hit with wildfires. So I was 14 at the time. I'm 22 now for context.
Yeah, you gave it away
I
when
was
you said
14 at the
Paradise
time.
wildfires. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I was just in my first year of high school, and I live a little bit further away from Paradise. I think I'm about 4 hours drive from there. But we smelled the smoke. The smoke came down to where I live, and the smoke was so bad that we started having, instead of like snow days, we had smoke days. So days where the air quality was so bad that we couldn't go outside, and we couldn't go to school. I remember one of the days when we were going to school, or, one of the weeks we were going to school throughout that smoke, feeling headaches, nausea, having it impact my like ability to study. And then I really, one thing that really hit home for me was driving home every day. And my mom likes to play the radio, like in her car. I don't know if you, you like to listen to the radio, but she would have the news on. And every day we would hear like the count of people that were missing in Paradise. And the numbers were growing rapidly, right? At first it was like 200 people missing, then it was 300, 350 people missing. And eventually we learned that, 85 people had perished in the Paradise wildfires. And I remember having the realization, I was this 14-year-old in the car. I remember having this realization like, wow, the smoke we're breathing in right now is these people's homes. It's their possessions. It's like everything they hold dear. And in some cases, these people's like actual bodies.
It's them.
It's them. Yeah. 85 people killed. And so that was a really, emotional, like touching impact for me, at that age. Especially realizing that, wealthy corporations and politicians are making the choice to sacrifice our community and our safety and our planetary viability for the short-term profit in the pockets of the few. And so that's what really made me throw everything into my organizing. Cause I remember staying up staying up awake late one night, around that time, around the Paradise wildfires, and kind of thinking to myself, like, I'm just a kid right now, right? Like there's not a whole lot I can do, but I know, like, I knew the science, I had learned it in school. And I was like, well, we only have so much time. I think at the time we had about 10 years left, they were saying, to drastically reduce our emissions before 2030, when we would hit certain, planetary boundaries. And so I was like, you know what, in these 10 years, I want to do everything that is within my power, to try to impact the climate crisis. And that's what I did. And so that's how I find myself here today.
As you're telling that story, there is hope and there's worry in it. And I'll tell you, and this is the first tangent we're going on this show. The hope was that you recognized something's happening and many other kids didn't. I mean, I'm sure you remember there were kids in your high school who just couldn't care less. They were too immersed in the NFL season, for example, or whatever it may be. It didn't matter, right? And so, you're thinking, whoa, right? But then there were people who cared, and there are people who joined Zero Hour. There are people who joined other organizations. There's people trying to do something, right? Especially in younger ages. But then my worry also set in through your story that it had to be the Paradise wildfires and the smoke that you inhaled for you to wake up. So had there not been that
Mhm.
wildfire, would you have woken up is the question. And generally, I tend to say, no, you wouldn't have, because what would have woken you up? Because you did see the tsunami across the planet. You did see the wildfire somewhere else. It did come on the news, but it doesn't wake us up until it knocks on our door, right? And the worry and the scariness of
Yeah.
it for me is, how many doors do we have to knock on, and how close do they have to be? I mean, Paradise happened about what, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and now you have wildfires across LA. Even in the wealthiest pockets of greater LA, right? And some mansions burned down. And so the people there didn't, the smoke got to them from Paradise, but they really, northern LA shores, they didn't really, like Palisades area and stuff, they didn't really react at that time. Now they're reacting. Now they're like, oh, we have to do something about it. So if we wait until every person gets a knock from a wildfire or smoke in their community to react, and even then, most of us don't even know how to react. We just get angry, but we don't know what to do. Um, is it sustainable? How dangerous or how scary is it that we only wake up when it hits us individually, right? I mean,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, that's a big question. There are some schools of thought that like, if that the climate crisis is expanding and impacting ever more people, even in small ways, like are relatively small, like less catastrophic than Paradise, but
mm,
maybe large heat waves and things like that. We are seeing that expand and impact more people, and so there is the hope that that will change people. But I think there is a big danger in the normalization of these extreme weather events, and people also feeling there has been an investment by the fossil fuel industry to of this like nihilistic narrative, like, oh,
mm,
it's too late, like you're gonna like experience some impacts of the climate crisis, but it's too late to do anything about it, so we might as well just let it all happen. And what we know at Zero Hour, what we're fighting for in the climate movement, is that every decimal of degree in warming avoided saves an untold number of lives. And so it is really impactful that we continue fighting. Currently, we're around 1.47-ish degrees in global temperature increase since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And global climate science says that we have to cap that at 1.5 degrees. Like the kind of the saying is 1.5, we
yeah.
might survive, right? And so we've seen drastic levels of warming. And I mean, you're right. It's not impacting everyone in the same way. And the people who have the most power to impact the climate crisis are people in the global north, people in the United States
Mm-hmm.
that are consuming and burning a huge amount of these fossil fuels. And we here in this country have been shielded from far more of the climate impacts than most of the rest of the world, most of the global south. A lot of countries in the global south are experiencing climate chaos on levels that, we might not experience here for another, 10 years or
Mm-hmm.
so, having not even, contributed that much to the climate crisis. So it is a big justice issue too, which is what we talk about a lot at Zero Hour. But one thing I like to ground people in when we're talking about like the future is climate science and like what
Mm,
it would look like in certain levels of degrees. The science says that a 3-degree world of warming, like as I was mentioning, 1.5, 3, this is 3 degrees above global average temperature increase from pre-industrial levels. That 3-degree increase would mean 3/4 of the global population would potentially be exposed to potentially lethal heat events every year. And that's assuming that there's no population boom. At 4 degrees, the world would be incompatible with organized human society. That's
mm-hmm.
a direct quote from the scientists. So we're talking about really extreme weather here. Food systems collapse, water
Right.
systems collapse. And so I really hope that not only, as a society, we can have like a red line on these,
Mm-hmm.
on these issues that we're like, okay, we're not going to cross this. We need to stand up now before it's too late. But that also people, who maybe aren't experiencing the effects of the climate crisis firsthand are able to have that wisdom and foresight to kind of see like, just because this isn't in my backyard yet doesn't mean it won't be, 2, 3 years down the
Right.
line even. Um, and so, I think it's good to prepare. Yeah.
And you know what? I'll take that even two steps further, and I'll say the concept of it's not in my backyard yet, but it may be, I should act, is also something that I personally don't believe will work as a warning because it embodies selfishness. So I'm not being
Mhm.
affected. You go ahead and die. Well, you know what? The wealthiest are going to continue playing that card of you go ahead and die because it's not affecting me.
Absolutely.
And you know what? I heard there are wildfires in LA right now, for example. And I live in Malibu, and I'm going to pack up my kids and everybody in my family and the pets and all, and put them on my plane. And we're going to go to our New York
Yeah.
residence because the temperature. My friends tell me it's nice there at this moment. So the house has insurance, everything's fine. We can replace the cars. Don't worry, honey, we're moving. And and you basically have vacations around climate crisis. It will become the new norm. There'll
Yeah.
be fashion seasons with new clothing depending on which area you're. Like I can see the whole,
Yeah.
art
It's
behind
already
it, right?
happened.
There
Yeah.
you go. It's already happening.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
we need to build a compassion base for us to say, we can't sit here and watch that person burn, right? And that becomes not at my door but at their door is wrong as well. So that's the
Mhm.
first thing, which brings in a host.
Yes.
We're not going to get into that, but it brings in a host of conversations like immigration. Why do you think people are leaving their
Absolutely.
cultures and their homes and their foods and their dances and their music and everything they know and love and is dear to them, and their football club and their community that they love and everything else, to come literally halfway across the globe to the north, enter a space where they don't speak
Yeah.
the language, are scared endlessly, are new, are refugees? All these situations happen to them along the way and while they're there. For what? They're not crazy. They're not coming up there because they're crazy. They're coming up there because of desperation, because of the will to survive. So that is one part. And another part is, have you noticed on the news and everywhere else how we don't report any other species other than humans? So there's a
Yes.
wildfire, and
Absolutely.
I recently saw something about there was a wildfire in Madrid, in the north part of Madrid, Spain, and I think about 29 horses perished in the stables. And this was the first time this, was mentioned because one person died, and the reason they died was trying to save those horses, right? And so they died saving those horses. So the horses came into the conversation. But if they had died independent of the horses, like they got locked in their car and died, and the horses also died, we still wouldn't have heard about the horses. It was just contextually aligned, so we heard about them. But all these wildfires, and from on the west coast, from British Columbia in Canada all the way down to La Jolla, all the way down the Mexican border, I've never heard
Yeah.
of one animal being mentioned, one bear, one nothing. And I'm sure there are
Yeah.
hundreds who are perishing in these ecosystems that are just vanishing. And again, there's no compassion for that conversation. So you're right about it, and I just want to add those points. Now, getting to a more positive side of what Zero Hour is doing, um, you know, I want to know something before we get into that. I want to know what measurable impact you've made, and that if we scale this measurable impact that you're going to talk about right now, how would it produce that tangible difference? And I will, tell you before you start answering, there are a lot of movements out there today. Okay. And at the scale of the amount of movements there are out there for climate issues, you would think that this problem is, on its way to being fully resolved, because there's every corner you turn, there's somebody with some organization. But then, without being very frank and candid, a lot of them are very, social media heavy, and just a lot of talk, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of like, let me show you some crazy images. You're like, oh my God, did you see that guy walk through the fire, and click likes and stuff like that. But then I go to their website, or go to like, where's the substance in your work, right? Where is the substance? Show me something you've done, right? And I reference it to other movements. For example, you think of Martin Luther King. Well, Dr. King said, my agenda is this. This is what I'm going to do. He did it. He died. And so, there was, you could follow this transition into something active that he did. at 0 hour, I've done the research a little bit. I'm here because I've done a little bit of that research, but I want you to tell the audience how you're doing things that if some of the billionaires in your area, in your region, actually pay attention to you and start investing some of that money, not on ROI, but what I call TBI. TBI stands for transformation by investment. It's what I believe the future is going to be. Let's invest in people like Jamie, because Jamie is going to make the world better. And that betterment over the next 20 years is going to end up being better farming, better economy, less cost of healthcare, less disaster costs. I mean, insurance companies are gonna one after the other go bankrupt over the next 20 years based on what we're seeing. Because how many houses are you going to actually pay out? How many roads are you going to reconstruct? Like how long do you think this game is going to go on before you have no funds to rebuild the entire United States as the 5 leading insurance companies in the country? So let's go through some of the measurable impacts of 0 hour so that we can kind of understand the scalability. Now, I want to bring the audience into this and say, we need to support these things. We need to scale them.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to talk about that. And I would also love to talk a little bit about our principles, our guiding principles, because I think it touches on a lot of the things that you mentioned, like the Anthropocene and migration. But in terms of tangible impacts, so we have focused a lot on education. We were one of the first organizations to do global climate strikes or global climate marches with the Global Climates March in, I believe, 2017. And we have had over 100 chapters globally, of young people organizing independently in their communities to have an impact on the climate crisis. And, we really aim to give young people the tools and support they need to take action on the climate crisis, the trainings. As a person who at a very young age, got involved in climate organizing, I know that the passion is there, just like how I felt in middle school, that anger, how I felt like the impacts of the climate crisis. I know there are so many young people out there in this world who feel the same way that I did, and who are just like chomping at the bit to take action. But it's hard. Like, adult organizers have a lot more resources behind them. They have a lot more knowledge. They have a lot more experience. It's really difficult to get into the climate movement as a young person without any of that. And so 0 hour plays a really critical role in educating people and training folks up on how to address the climate crisis in their communities. So that's a big part of our role right now, giving young people the ability to take action. Mm-hmm. And then in terms of our agenda, we have several big campaigns that we're working on a global level. In the US, some of our biggest campaigns are around the build out of liquefied natural gas. And so this is a bit of a technical industry term, liquefied natural gas, but basically it's gas that's been compressed. It's been cooled and compressed to turned into a liquid, like fossil gas, methane. And then it's shipped across the world to whatever country it's going to be burned in. And right now we're seeing a huge expansion of the liquefied natural gas industry in the United States, particularly in communities of color on the Gulf South Coast. And so it's a huge environmental justice issue because we're seeing, the folks in these communities, these are communities like Cancer Alley that have already been really impacted by the petrochemical industry. And so these communities, they're losing, family members and friends already to cancer and to the impacts of the industries that have been poisoning them for decades. And now this influx of liquefied natural gas is coming in. And, we're seeing numbers of estimates that new projects could cause up to 60 deaths a year, right? Of real people in these communities. I talk to folks that we have frontline organizations that we take the lead from. And, we talk to folks who go to funerals almost every weekend. I mean, it's really, really disgusting what these industries are doing. And not only that is we see that the impacts of liquefied natural gas, these frontline communities are the canaries in the coal mine for what will happen globally if these liquefied natural gas plants are allowed to go into effect in the United States. These plants have extraordinarily higher impact on emissions than even coal. There are studies that show, to 33% higher emissions than domestic coal power plants from these LNG facilities. And so, and that's without even, calculating how much impact burning that LNG is. So I'm getting a little in the weeds here, but that's one of our big campaigns, is working on LNG, both at a UN level, in negotiations, but also in a local organizing level. We've been educating young people and building out our base of folks who are ready to throw down on this issue. And the other issue that we're working on in the United States right now is opposing fossil fuel subsidies. And so, as we see, there are around $20 billion in fossil fuel subsidies in the United States per year. That's $20 billion in taxpayer money that is lining the pockets of the fossil fuel industry. And now with the Trump administration's reconciliation bill, another 18 billion in handouts has been allocated to the fossil fuel industry. And there was a report by the Stockholm Institute in 2021 that as much as 60% of future oil and gas development would not be economically viable without subsidies. And so we're looking to we know that solar and wind are cheaper. We know that these fossil fuel industries would not be able to be as profitable, would not be able to expand on this level if they didn't have our money lining their pockets. And so we're going after that as well. And we're part of a coalition that United to End Polluter Handouts that is working on that issue. And so those are some of our projects in the United States that we're working on. Globally, we have some amazing organizers who are doing fantastic work. One of our organizers, who's the director of Zero Hour Philippines and Zero Hour Asia, was just at the Global Climate Plastics Treaty conference, working to try to reach an agreement on ending, the build out of the petrochemical industry and plastics. And so we have a lot of really great organizers working on that. We have folks in Ethiopia working on drought assistance and relief. And so in their communities that are really impacted by drought in farming. And so I could go on and on. I'm so proud of all the organizers that we work with. That's just kind of a taste of what we've been working on. And then in terms of our guiding principles, we really see that the people on the front lines of the climate crisis should be the leaders of that movement. And the people that are on the front lines of the climate crisis are the people in the global South, people of color, indigenous peoples, young people, folks with disabilities, women, people in poverty. And so, that's what we aim to. It's at the core of our guiding principles. And we see youth leadership as being transformational and visionary, that we lead, that culture shift, but also that every generation must lean on each other in order to learn from each other's wisdom, and to, impact this crisis. And we also, part of our platform is seeing animals on the front lines of the climate crisis. As you said, we are living through the Anthropocene right now. And as folks who are on the front lines are the canaries in the coal mine, animals are the literal canaries in the coal mine. When we're seeing this mass species die off, we humans, we like to see ourselves as so separate from the natural world, quote unquote, but we're animals too. We are a part of this global planetary system. And what's happening to our animal brothers and sisters is happening to us as well. We all rely on each other in some way. And so we see that as a really important part of our movement. And finally, migration is a really, really big issue when it comes to the climate crisis. We know that a lot of people who are immigrating, especially, globally right now from the global South to the global North as well, but also just within the United States, are not only climate migrants, but they're experiencing extreme state violence right now as a result of their need to migrate. And it's not only incredibly disgusting, the actions of, the administration that is allowing this to happen, and past administrations that have allowed, this kind of state level violence to happen, targeting migrants. But it is also incredibly short-sighted, given the fact that, people in this country will likely have to migrate in the near future due to the climate crisis. And so this is definitely a key issue for us as well.
And you're from California, and I always remind people in California when we get into sticky conversations about migration, from just jumping Tijuana to La Jolla, for example, to San Diego, I tell them, one day you're going to jump California to one of your bordering states because there will be no California.
Yeah,
And then that bordering state will,
absolutely.
jump. So how do you feel if somebody stood in front of you and raised the wall and said, no, no, die on that wave, die on that wave, You wouldn't like
Hmm.
that. So let's try to figure something out where, we can all together work through this. But it's hard. It's hard to really change. And also it's so deeply embedded in us civilizationally to have that fear mindset lead us, that a lot of the reactions that we're seeing today are coming from that fear mindset. I mean, we know scarcity is there and we think, okay, we are in a scarcity situation, for example, and it's going to get worse. So better not let the new people in because, I'll say, I'll live longer. My kids may live longer if we keep this fight on. So it's hard to shift that mindset, and then to shift it even further to animals becomes something you're asking too much of today's mentality. And it comes down to a mix of that fear mindset and capitalism built in together. Now,
Yeah, perhaps. I think that, people really maybe when they're thinking in that fear level mindset, lose the fact that, or lose sight of the fact that our liberation and our freedom and our health is tied up in one another. I'm not healthier if you're being poisoned.
mhm,
Like no one is healthy if there is poison in our
mhm,
system, in our planetary system, right? People think like, oh, let's put the impacts over there and they won't hurt me,
right,
but like water and air travel, they don't see borders.
right,
um you know like climate impacts are global, and so when we're poisoning our environment in this way, you know when our nations are targeting people with this level of violence, it has an impact on us and it has an impact on everyone within this system. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you,
no,
but
no, no, no.
yeah.
Go ahead, and
Yeah.
you're right, and also the time frame of how we destroyed the world is also interesting for me because we go back. Let's just, for the sake of not arguing the numbers, but let's just call it 10,000 years of civilization, right? And throughout that 10,000 years, I mean, we just put our hand in any river and drank, and it was fine, and you could do that up until maybe just like 100 years ago. Let's just call it a century ago, right? From a century ago to now, most rivers or water flows or anything like that, you got to think twice before you take a sip out of it because you're like, I don't know what goes through this. Like, I don't, like you said poison, and I remember these things, and I was like, you don't know. Like even state water coming through, like Michigan, is a big issue. I mean, this is the United States. You're not even expecting this. Like you're expecting to see a front page issue about some kind of corruption and things like that, and sewage water going through some, really poor developing nation that couldn't afford anything better. And then you're all of a sudden, you're like Detroit, like Michigan, Flint, all these cities that you're mentioning, like you're talking about the grandfathers of the auto industry, all that wealth in that, state. How does this happen? And so it becomes so fearful, right? I mean, you start thinking, wow, this is a lot worse than I thought. Now, the climate fight is often criticized as being heavy on awareness, but light on structural change, which is what we touched on earlier briefly. Um, this is more so for the other organizations, not so much for the general audience like myself who's listening to this because we're interested in the topic, but for the other organizations who are in the climate space who you can kind of speak to right now. Share with them how you ensure your work translates into long-term policy wins or systemic shifts like you're doing, like some of the stuff you mentioned, in Asia right now that you guys are involved in, and that instead of the symbolic victories of even marches, marches without real cause. I've gone to marches where I purposefully walked among people and I said, what's going on here? What's the gathering about? Right. And they say, oh, climate change. And I was like, okay. And then I said, where do you bank? Randomly. And it's a random question. Like, what do you mean, where do and I said, just humor me for a second. Where do you bank? And they'll say something like HSBC. And I'm like, okay. As
Yeah.
you're standing here holding this placard and yelling and the water gun's coming at you, and you might lose an eye in this protest, and you're you're there. God bless you that you're there for that and you're willing to go all the violence all the way. But did you know that in your back pocket, that card that you have that says HSBC on it is working double time, investing that money into fossil fuel? So if you would have sat at home and
Yeah.
watched a game and had a beer instead, you would have been doing more by canceling your HSBC bank account than you're doing at this. So the education is so important. And I feel like so many people are out there trying to be visible and out there trying to create these marches and out there trying to just have a microphone or a megaphone and yell. And that's what gets the likes. That's what gets the money even flowing, unfortunately, because if you're quiet and doing the work and people aren't seeing you, then, that billionaire is not going to invest that 100 million into your organization because we don't see you anywhere. But these people have 2 million followers, in their organization. So we're going to put the money there. What do you do that ensures you guys don't sell out, for lack of any other word, and actually go for the policy? Because that's the ultimate goal. If we can't change policy or make policy, the rest is hopeless unless without policy, we're collecting the entire community. I mean, the other way is if every American is influenced by you and says, we are no longer buying this product because of these issues that, are policy issues, but we're going to do it ourselves without the government's involvement. That's the other way. But I mean, obviously policy is the way to go. So tell us a little about that and for the other organizations.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And tells me it's one I've been thinking about a lot over the years, seeing kind of the rise and fall of different eras of the climate movement, right? I mean, at Zero Hour, for example, we have in recent years, especially since the pandemic, invested a lot of our time and energy into policy and into organizing. Now we're, entering a front-loading phase on our organizing efforts. And, when you invest a little less in your communication strategy and, invest a little less time in Instagram, you do see that difference in funding. And, and so I definitely, I see where you're coming from for sure on that. I think, unfortunately, there was a certain era of the climate movement where we saw, a lot like kind of clout entering the movement space in a way that I think was really unhealthy. And at the end of the day, I mean, so for a little background on me and like where I was at that time, I was organizing locally during like 2019 and those youth climate strikes, 2017 through I guess 2021, really. I was organizing locally in the Bay Area. I started San Jose Youth Climate Strikes, became a Silicon Valley org, and we were doing like on the ground kind of local level stuff, but we were hearing and seeing a lot of what was going on like nationally and internationally in the movement spaces. And don't get me wrong, I am such a big fan of like all of the climate movements that are organizing today. And, there are some really fantastic organizers that I learn a lot from, not trying to tear anyone down. But I do think, unfortunately, there was a very toxic kind of mentality that kind of worked its way into the movement, where, young people were really strategic in moving the needle forward on climate change during that time, because we had that moral authority. We were children and we were showing up to protest, and that got attention. We were able to change policy. I was able to change local level policy, just by showing up as a kid in city council meetings. Like it really makes people stand up and pay attention. And that is great, like strategically. But then if you're a kid and you're getting all this like positive attention, that sometimes it can go to your head, right? And I think at the end of the day, we saw a lot like, of teenagers having a lot of, responsibility, a lot of like media attention, and it can lead to those issues, of like clout or selling out, becoming, like profit becoming more of the motivation of some people.
Doing it doing the climate thing for the gram instead of doing it for the
Yeah,
purpose.
absolutely. And it's really unfortunate. I think that, I want to believe in the best intentions of most of the folks in the movement. It is interesting now to see as the political sort of zeitgeist has shifted and that, another administration has taken power, to see a couple people in the climate movement totally 180 and totally switch.
Mm-hmm.
That is really interesting to
They have to
see
pay their
the
mortgage
grift.
somehow, right? I mean, that's the bottom
I
line.
guess so.
The bottom line of, creating your .org is to pay the mortgage. I mean, if it wasn't the .org, it'd be a McDonald's franchise. It didn't matter. It was just that the .org was the possible one at the time. That's the unfortunate thing. How do you not
Yeah.
fall into that? Because you're not an obscure person. You're somebody that's visible, that I can find online. Your organization is one that I can find online. It's not some, like, I'd have to hear it from my neighbor to know who you are. So you're there. You're out there. Being that you're out there, how do you not let the spotlight get to you? And how do you not make sure that you are in the right pose with your 0 hour shirt sticking out at the protest so that the camera person can take that perfect picture for your website? Because unfortunately, sometimes I look at some websites or I look at the news, I'm like, this organization had this rally. And you look at the rally, you're like, you guys organize all your shirts, all your shoes, there's a little too much organization for me to feel like you all came out full force for this, right? And it worries me. So how do you not do that? How do you not
Yeah.
fall for that? How do you not be like, yeah, let me strike a pose?
Yeah, that's a funny question. I like that. Well, I mean, I think a big part of it that probably is true of not only myself, but most of the people, the vast majority of people who care about climate change, and who care, we're showing up to this movement because we care about people. We're motivated to care for our loved ones, the places we call home, maybe the animals around us, right? Like we're here with a mission, and we are here. It's a lot of work, like a lot of
Mm-hmm.
background work. I worked all throughout college, in high school on this issue. I think the people that have honestly at this point stuck around in the movement are here for the right reasons for the most part. Because we're definitely entering an era where there are a lot more negative consequences than positive ones
Mm.
for being visible in the movement in some ways, at least in this country right now. Um, but I think, like, personally, it's definitely a journey. Like, I think, there were definitely times where I might have made mistakes. There are definitely times when I had to learn. Like, again, being a young person, you are thrust into a lot of responsibility at a very young age in this movement, and you just have to figure it out as you go. So, I try to give people compassion, but I think for me, really just like staying grounded in why I'm fighting, and what I'm fighting for is important. I also get a lot of like stage fright, in speaking engagements.
You're in the
So
wrong place.
for me, I definitely have had to, I have been, visible in the movement, but I also, on a personal level, you're doing a great job of making me feel comfortable here, but I personally definitely get very nervous to do speaking engagements or to, be very visible on social media. So, I love it when other people have the spotlight a little bit more than myself sometimes. Um, but yeah, I'm not sure if that entirely answers the question. But yeah, I think that I definitely know what you're talking. Like I
Mhm.
went to school in Washington D.C. I definitely have organized around folks who are interested in the media and like personality aspect a
Mhm.
little bit more than the organizing aspect. And at the end of the day, what we can do is call people in, and I think that's, yeah, I mean, what can be impactful. I don't know. I'm trying to. I have a lot of thoughts on this. This was a little bit of a curveball. I wasn't prepared, but I like this conversation topic.
Okay. And you know what? I think that's
Yeah.
the difference between somebody who's in it for the cause versus you know, a traditional word for this, the politician. I mean, like you said, you
Yeah.
went to school in the right area for that. People are there because they're trying to make the right connections and network in the right way so that they land in those spaces, right? I mean, you want to end up somehow in the White House with a job there. That's why you're there. So whatever that conversation is, you find your way into that conversation versus your values. So, if you have to shift your values because you're going to get that job and it's going to secure your life and everything else, well, so be your values, right? Versus
Yeah.
somebody who says, I don't care if I'm going to be House Secretary. I'm not breaking those values. And like, okay, so I guess you're not being House Secretary. And then, you ship your bags and you move back to wherever you came from. And you're like, well, that didn't work out. Well, that didn't work out because you have values. You are human. You're not a politician. You're not a machine. So, that's why you're sitting where you are, and somebody you went to school with is sitting in that office there. And you're like, I remember when we were,
Yeah.
in the same dorm room, but no, not anymore. And you know why? Because
Yeah,
you knew that person. I've had friends like that too, who change
definitely.
colors like a chameleon, and that's a talent on its own as well. I do tell them. I say, don't be ashamed of it, because we watch chameleons on, National Geographic and other, networks. Like, wow, did you see that? Or the octopus, right? I mean, you see the octopus is like, boom, change color, shape, everything. Like, wow, that's amazing. So I look at my friend and I said, see, like, this is amazing what you can do. I can't do that. I stay with the same face, unfortunately. It sucks. I wish I had your talent. So I get what you're
That's so
saying.
funny.
It's staying true, and that's powerful. Now, sticking with that, then it becomes a financial issue too, because sometimes when you're honest and you have values, and you don't break them, and you don't shift them, and you don't play ball, as they say, you get stuck. So, a lot of the youth movements, I speak to quite a few of them, and they have all the passion, they have all the drive, they have networks that older, more traditional organizations couldn't even dream of, in terms of riling people and preparing and stuff. Like, I know you guys, other people I speak with, youth organizations, they can organize a rally like for tomorrow. They have that like firepower to do that, right? And then you speak to a big, huge monster organization that's been around for 100 years, that has millions, and you tell them, we want to organize something. Like, okay, let's put that in the agenda for like February 2026. And you look at them like, wow, that's your capacity. Like, that's how strong you are. So I love the passion, the power, the movement, the nimbleness, and the agility of youth organizations. Somehow you guys don't get funding. And part of it is, I think, the same thing that happened with feminism, right? The growth of feminism. Like, women were, well, they still are, but I mean, traditionally, you go back a few decades and you could do the same job as a man does, and there's no way you qualify for equality, because you're a woman. It's just traditionally, it's imprinted in us. So it's now imprinted in us. I think this is the first generation, so to speak, somebody of my age or older, somebody in their 60s. Doesn't matter how much information you have, doesn't matter how well spoken you are, doesn't matter how much you know about the topic. Like, you probably see this when you're in United Nations circles or other places where it's a lot of older people, and then you're like, it's my turn to speak, and they're like, oh, the child wants to speak. And so it's like that originally. And I remember when Greta came up, the first times she had the podium, people were not watching her with that educational respect, or with the her emotional involvement in what she was trying to bring to light. They were like, yay, we have a child here, this is how inclusive we are. It was kind of like that, right? And then it became, oh wow, children are speaking, like they're saying some important things, we should take note. So there is this kind of discrimination that's going on right now, and I think it's going to take a while before you guys walk out of it, by showing that you can do, and doing things like 0 Hour does, right? Like, change policy. They're like, no, I may be 22, but how many policies have you changed at 65? Being in the position of actually signing the policy? None. I was never in the
Yeah.
position, and I've changed 2. So there you go. So when you do these kind of things, it starts to bring in that. But 2 questions. One, what is the one thing you would start with? And it's short answer. One thing you would start with if you were given no financial constraints. So somebody like Bill Gates knocks on your door and says, Jamie, sky's the limit. What are you going to do? What is that one thing you would like, you automatically know, this is what I'm going to do? And before you answer that, the second is, what are your financial constraints? Which is the longer part of the question, meaning, like, what hurts you today? So you can answer whichever way you want.
Yeah. Oh, that's a big question. I mean, for the first one, about, say Bill Gates knocks on my door. We see that not only are youth movements extremely underfunded, but frontline youth movements in particular, movements in the global south, movements in the places that are most impacted by the climate crisis, indigenous youth movements are extremely underfunded and extremely impactful when it comes to having an impact on the climate crisis. For example, there's a statistic, or there was a study that was done that 80% of global biodiversity is protected by indigenous people who make up just 5% of the global population. So these key stakeholders need to be funded, their sovereignty regained and land back should be restored, and should be a principle of funding for the climate movement, in my opinion. And so if Bill Gates were to approach me, I think that I would really it's hard to say one particular thing to start with, if we had unlimited funding, but I think building out and resourcing movements of young people around the world or chapters of organized young people around the world that are based in the global south and that are especially indigenous led. I work with an organizer named Wia, who we met at a global climate conference at COP in Dubai. And he's a fantastic organizer and land defender, indigenous to the Yasuni jungle in the Amazon. And he and his friends are facing violence from oil companies that are on their land, trying to take parts of the Amazon away from them and, being violent towards their community of land defenders. And so we're trying to fundraise for him right now, but it's extremely difficult. And so, I would definitely say that is one of the most important, causes that to be funded in the youth climate
and what
space.
kind of funding are you talking about? I want the audience to hear numbers.
You mean how much were we able to get for him so
far?
No.
How much are you, for example, you're trying to help this person in the Amazon right now. What are we talking about? Are we talking about $5,000 or $5 million? What is the ballpark that helps them be able to make change for their own societies?
I mean, right now they're operating on very little, is my understanding. I'm not there on the ground, so I don't want to speak to, what maybe like something that I don't know. Right. But, the money that we're using that we're sending is going towards basics like food and medicine, and like medical costs of people who have been like literally stabbed by like oil company,
mercenaries,
folks from the oil companies. Yeah. Mercenaries,
yeah,
exactly.
Oil company mercenaries. And so, this is a real thing. I didn't just make it up. It's a real thing. They hire these armies to come in and protect 100%. Their investments. It's a militant, and there are so many people making hundreds of millions of dollars providing this kind of service. It's like a bodyguard with a weapon and shoot to kill license.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, I don't know. I would have to come to Wia to ask him, specifically what he is, like, level of funding, what he could do with different levels of funding. But I know that right now, the needs that they have are on the level of food and medicine, food and medical care. So that just speaks to how drastically underfunded these organizers are.
Yeah, which is why I asked about number, because I wanted to shock the audience to make them understand that these people saving 80% of the biodiversity and essentially the food that we eat comfortably and waste half of are people who are living on nickels and dimes. We're not talking about, food and Medicare is not a $5 million campaign that you're working on. It's literally, little money that is holding our world together.
And imagine, given how underfunded they are, but how much they are doing, even despite that the extreme, systemic barrier, and also the extreme state violence that is constantly being, they're being targeted with, given how much they're doing now. I mean, think of how much could be achieved if, global leaders listened to indigenous leaders, and actually took their advice and saw them as key stakeholders rather than the corporations that are poisoning our planet. Right. Imagine if we held land defenders as sovereign leaders on a international level. And if land back were invested in as a practice, and we put people over profit in that way, I mean, the climate crisis would be a very different conversation today.
100%. And that's actually a very good answer. I will, but before you even go there, that was really, really insightful what you said. I love what you said, because I'm working on with a group of indigenous leaders globally. And the sad part is, again, the education. It always comes back to the education because because I know from what you're talking about, but the thing is, you speak of indigenous communities, and unfortunately, a lot of Americans and Canadians think, it's that settlement somewhere, that has a casino and sells tobacco and stuff outside their town, and that's the only indigenous people in the world. You tell them they're indigenous people in India and they're indigenous people, in Latin America, and they're like, oh, I didn't know. Canadians think the indigenous communities are the ones that are just up in the north in the Yukon territories and some other places like that. They're not really that involved, and they don't know that so much education comes from that community. So much of our agricultural education comes from there. And we're today doing things scientifically that are really things that these guys have been doing for millennia, and you're like,
Yes.
but the arrogance of us saying, unless it comes out from the lab and it's FDA stamped, like, no. So, these are
Yeah.
the issues. So I love that you raised that. And we're doing a study right now with a group of them to publish, some of this education and to be able to share that globally in a way that people can start recognizing the value and start really investing into the 5% that you're talking about, who are protecting our 80%. Because, I mean, what other team are you going to do that through? And I'm going to change my
Right.
name from Bill Gates to Jeff Bezos as a, gazillionaire for you, because Jeff Bezos, actually did invest in, in indigenous, I think it was education and book literacy and things like that. Probably after a ski trip he had to Aspen or something like that, and he's kind of understanding about those things somehow. And I haven't seen Bill Gates do anything like that, so I'm gonna switch the name and say, Jeff Bezos, please knock on her door so you can help with this. But yeah, the second part of the question about what would you do with the money is, what are your costs and how do you get by, and like how does 0 hour function, and what are you short with, and kind of like give us a real, like a candid conversation about how you make ends meet.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would say we have an incredible team of volunteers that do a lot of fantastic work. And one, of our fundraising goals is to be able to pay more of the folks that do incredible work with us, because we would love to be able to really scale out our efforts. Folks, when they're volunteering, you can only give a few hours of your time each week. And again, we have a lot of incredible volunteers who have given their time over the course of years. I started out as a volunteer at 0 Hour, and I'm now the executive director. And so we definitely, would love to bring more folks up and uplifts folks to be funded to do this work. We just hired our first 2 full-time employees, myself and my coworker, Amelia, Southern Oribe. And Amelia and I are, greatly able to increase our capacity now that we are funded to do this work full time. And so, yeah, I think that would be one of our big impacts. We're also we use our funding to send folks internationally to these, UN climate conferences.
Mhm.
Like I said, our director of Asia, 0 Hour Asia, he was not only just at the plastics conference I believe a month or 2 ago, he was also a key youth stakeholder in the fight for loss and damage and fair climate reparations at the UN level. And we've had, folks involved in COPs and UN climate conferences. And so we are actually able to, make sustainable policy impacts on a global scale if we have the funding to send folks.
And you know what's sad?
And then finally,
These
I think,
places, wait, before you
yeah,
go on, what's really sad is that
yeah,
these places don't fund you to go in and speak and give your ideas and do the good of the world. Like COP is a huge organization. They have, I don't even want to say, they have unlimited funding. Let's just put it that way. And yet somebody like you is going to go there and actually speak about something advantageous to the goals that this organization has been created for. has to find their own way and knock on the door and go in there and find a seat and pay for their meal and everything else to provide service. And it goes to show
Yeah.
me that a lot of those organizations are kind of like a tourist industry now. Because like as they go around the world with their COPs, like cities, it's like the Olympics now, right? Whereas I could even see the
Yeah.
Olympics not pay the athletes to come, and the athletes would still, pay to be there for the value of that medal or what they're doing in a sense. So at the end of the day, it becomes business as well. Whereas you would think that if I had all the money in the world, I would create a conference and I'd invite everybody and I'd say, everybody's tickets are paid for. Everybody come here. Let's gather around the table and see what we can do about this and solve it once and for all in this one conference. I don't need an annual conference for 50 years to tell me the problem from the first conference that it could have been solved. So go on. I get so
Right.
frustrated sometimes about the ways of things.
Yeah.
I interrupt you, but I'm sorry. It's just,
No,
I can't deal
I
with
completely agree. No, I completely agree. I feel the same way. And having been to the last two COPs myself, I think another really key aspect of that is how many polluters and fossil fuel industry lobbyists are
yes.
fully funded to attend these conferences. We see a really strong civil society presence at these COPs of, young people, particularly from the global south, who are doing fantastic organizing work at these conferences and really shifting the needle in a positive way. But it's such an uphill battle because we're just increasingly every year seeing more and more fossil fuel lobbyists attend these conferences and get their way.
Because it matters now. It
It's
matters.
Yeah.
They have
And
to be there.
especially this COP, the city that the COP is being held in this year, Belém in Brazil, I'm not sure if you've heard, the housing is extremely expensive. We're not sure if we're going to be able to send someone because the housing, we're looking at estimates of $1,500 a night at these places. And so, who's going to be able to afford that is
Yeah,
fossil fuel
exactly.
industry executives,
Uh,
not young people who are trying to make an
Right.
impact.
And it's
And
partly
so it's going to have an
right.
extreme
But it's also
consequence.
a societal issue, right? I mean, this is where the capitalism blocks the movement because at the same time, now
Yes.
you're realizing you're like, oh, this COP thing is a happening thing, right? How much can we milk out of it as a touristic operation? Because I have a hotel. This is the only event that's going to happen in my town. This is where I make the big bucks. I'm going to set my price at 3,000 a night and see what happens. So no one's booking. Okay, 2,500. No one's booking. Okay, 2,000. Oh, people are booking. I'm keeping it there. I don't care if Jamie can show up or not because I don't care Jamie's voice. I care about how much I make for my hotel. And so when that capitalism comes in, it also, right? And COP does that. It brings in a whole economy into the towns that they select. So it's unfortunate, but I would assume that, a different story, but never mind. Now,
Yeah.
you talk about different spaces, migration, things, animals, the way environmentalism or the environmental issue affects things on a broader perspective. I love that you do that. A lot of organizations don't, believe it or not. They're kind of like sticking to one space. Like they will go and attack the airline industry and think that attack by itself single-handedly is going to resolve the climate issue, and it's not. Injustices play a big role into that. So far as child trafficking plays a role into that. So everything's kind of tied together, right? I like that you guys have that understanding that the economics, the racial equity, cultural issues, health, all of those are kind of tied into the environmental issue. Now, you've spoken a little about this, so I'm not going to ask you to be redundant, but how do you kind of position these or integrate them in your work in the sense that when you go to a COP meeting or other environmentalist meetings, a lot of these things are obscure. They don't show up on the radar there. I mean, nobody, I can't remember a COP meeting, for example, that spoke about the migration issue as a firsthand importance of what's happening environmentally and how do we account for that and how do we mobilize people with just giving them, I guess, climate refugee statuses in their passport or some kind of immediate, relief system. And there was no conversations of this. You guys are bringing some of that into your considerations and all of that. So how does that balance out inside Zero Hour?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Well, for starters, I mean, intersectionality has been at the core of our work since we were founded, in the heart of our mission. And it was a huge part of the reason why we were founded. We had a training that one of our founders, Jamie Margolin, was instrumental in spreading, called Getting to the Roots of Climate Change, that we used to recruit and train young people to join our movement. And we still use to this day. And it really kind of explained to young people, the roots of, this never-ending profit machine of capitalism, and racial inequality and health, and prison systems and disability and gender discrimination, and how all of these systems tie together to create what we see now as the current consequences of the climate crisis. And so that has been at a core part of our education work throughout the years. Our platform really emphasizes these issues. I think that we aim to bring these issues into every room that we enter. We sometimes, like you mentioned, COP. Some like last COP in Azerbaijan. We were entering the room with representatives of the State Department, with congressional members, with folks who have a lot of power, right? And so we want to make sure that we are bringing those folks that we are, the messaging that we're trying to represent into every room. This particularly is important around issues like Palestine and the genocide that is happening in Gaza, and bringing that issue into these rooms with world leaders that are contributing to that problem, and contributing to that genocide, with their funding. I think one practical, way that we've done this is with our campaigns as well. So as I mentioned, our campaigns around liquefied natural gas, which is a racial justice and global justice issue, that we really choose our campaigns based on how well that they target systemic inequality in addition to the climate crisis. So we know that LNG is not only going to extremely impact poor communities and communities of color in the United States, it's also a global impact. It would push us over, these US LNG projects would push us over all of the global goals around keeping below 1.5 degrees of warming. And so we really try to make sure that the things we put our effort into are issues that are that are intersectional. Another issue of intersectionality that we have really focused on in recent years is Fair Share's climate reparations. As the U.S. has a historic responsibility for the climate crisis, we are historically the biggest polluter of fossil fuels globally. We're currently the biggest producer of oil and gas globally, and so making sure that not only the United States, contributes their nationally determined contribution of reducing our emissions by 85% by 2030, or 80% by 2035, and also invests money into the communities that this country has harmed by releasing these emissions. And as an organization too, we come from a very intersectional perspective. The org is primarily made up of and led by young people of color. For the 3 years I've been on leadership here, I've been the only white person, and most of our founders are come from backgrounds of, folks who are from families who are from the global South. And so they really have not only, identify with these issues, but they also have experienced them firsthand.
Lived experience.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, yes, exactly. And so I hope that addresses the question a bit.
Yes,
but
for sure.
Yeah,
and
happy to answer follow-ups.
One follow-up is this. You mentioned that the U.S. is the greatest contributor to the biggest problem we face. I mean, the problem of potential extinction. And I want to separate that from, the apocalyptic and all these other conversations, because the Earth is not going to explode. The world's not going to end. Nothing's going to happen. We're just going to go into this really dire, disastrous state of living, if we continue the way we are. And it's going to be really hard. And the majority of people are going to die. And, our population may drop down to maybe 500 million people at some point. So this is what we're looking at. And like you said, the United States is the primary reason this will happen. So should the efforts not be globally singled into United States instead of a lot of the philanthropy and the work be purposed towards the globe? Because I see a lot of people out there doing, philanthropic, supportive works in the global South that is not really aimed to systemic progress, in the sense that, you know, how you mentioned 5% of the indigenous world, essentially 5% of the population are caring for 80% of our biodiversity. The majority of that 5% are not in the United States. So we need to save them. We need to support them. We need to protect them. We need to be there with them and aid. And that's fine. That is something that requires financial aid and volunteer support and some kind of, state level communication to support them, some policy, all of which really ties into money. But when you come to the global north, especially the US and Europe, you're not talking about money anymore. There's an abundance of money. There's an abundance of that's why the problem happened, because every corner is a mall and every corner is a coffee shop and a store. You're shopping all the time. You're over consuming ridiculously and it's a disaster. So that's capitalism for you, right? I mean, we need to keep spending to stay alive, essentially. It's this disastrous system. What do you think about, let's turn the vision inwards and say, we need to start at a spiritual level to shift our mindsets from this, shopping hauls on Instagram, getting millions of views, to actually, shifting that lens to, here's 1 million views to the scientist who's going to tell you how you're not going to die in the next 20 years from cancer, as opposed to, here's, some fast fashion brand who's going to put some nylon t-shirt on you and you're going to get sick because of that going into your body and the foods you're eating and the credit card equivalent of plastic you're consuming on a weekly or monthly basis. This is, and all the fast food chains and all of this, I could go on forever, right? This is happening in the United States. It's not happening in the indigenous community in Peru or Argentina or Brazil or any of those places. So where do we start with that shift? To take accountability and to change. And how are you addressing that? Do you think about that at all? Is it on your radar, or are you strictly in no, we don't care about any of that. We're right now just fighting this.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touch on a really important point, is that we need a huge culture shift within the United States and the global north, because, where the money has been in terms of advertising, has really, and what are social norms really, has shifted this cultural zeitgeist into something where, like you said, rampant mass consumerism is the norm in this country, right? And I think that funding movements in the global South does actually play a role in shifting that norm, because the US is, very unique in our perspective from the imperial core. We consume a really unsustainable amount of goods and services, and we, as you say, like, we are shielded from the impacts of our actions for now, but we are living in a way that is unrealistic. Our economic system is unrealistic to the boundaries of our planet, and people outside of this country, I think, understand that. I think people who don't live this hyper consumerist lifestyle, aren't raised in that culture, understand it a lot better than we do. And so I think, I do think that funding global South movements can play a role in that culture shift. Because right now we see that the folks with the microphone are the companies. They're the folks that are doing the exploiting, not the people that are being exploited. So I think that might play a role. I think another thing that your point reminds me of is a recent ICJ ruling, the International Court of Justice ruling around fossil fuels. They came out with a lot of really great stuff in this ruling, but a couple of the things that really stood out were that they declared climate action as a legal obligation for nations, and also declared that fossil fuel production and licensing may constitute an internationally wrongful act, which I think is a huge culture and like narrative shift for a lot of people, particularly folks living in these like hyper consumerist cultures like we are in the United States. Seeing like the production and consumption of fossil fuels is like a crime internationally. It's a huge step. And so I don't know if this fully addresses your question,
Well,
but
yes, but I'm gonna push back
yeah,
on that because
challenge me. Go ahead.
okay, so I don't know how well you know your history, but you had a prohibition era
Yeah.
in the United States.
Yes.
And alcohol and the consumption of alcohol and the purchase and sale of alcohol became illegal. The public wanted alcohol. Did that stop anybody from consuming alcohol, even though it became illegal? No.
Yes.
You created Al Capone. You created a whole underground community. You created a whole genre of music because of it. So a lot of great things happened from this and a lot of bad things happened from this. But eventually the government said, the hell with it all. Just put the alcohol on the shelf. It doesn't work anyways. What if the law gets to the point where I'm going to learn to have an underground network to give me my hyper-consumerism at a much elevated cost that's going to be really, expensive for the government, because now the government's not getting the tax money from this hyper-consumption on top of it, yet they have to cover the healthcare issues and all these other things that come about from it, the infrastructural issues. And so after a decade or so, the government's going to turn around and say, you know what? H&M just went from upstairs to downstairs, so it really didn't change anything. The only difference is we're not making money from the money they're making. We're not getting taxes. So might as well put them back in the mall and monitor them and get the taxes, because why? Because I still want it, right? So I think my pushback is we still need a mindset. We still need a holistic shift. It doesn't matter how much law you put in there. Nobody, our violence rate is going up in the United States annually, okay? In a sense of, you look at murders, you look at other things like that, and it's happening more, okay? You could ban guns. In most, murder is banned everywhere in the United States. It's not like there's a state that's like, oh, no, you can murder at will, and that's where it's the highest statistics. It's banned everywhere, and you get everything from life to capital punishment. All sorts of designs are out there. Is it working really? No, because the culture of violence is somehow embedded through the arts. The film industry, many other industries, kind of the gaming industry, they influence that culture. The sports industry, when you have MMAs and things like that, there's a violence culture that is amplified and is celebrated, even though some of it is fake too, like, you're wrestling, the WWE, it's not real violence. I mean, they're not really killing each other in that ring, but it's a simulation of violence, right? So this plays a part into creating the culture. So in the same way, when you go into environmentalism, unless you are able to change the person's holistic spiritual mindset into saying, I understand why I should rewear my t-shirt and keep it for 10 years because yada, 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 versus why not buy 3 t-shirts for the price of 2? It makes absolute sense. It makes absolute sense. And it does economically, and when you look at economics, if you ever go to economics school, one of the first things they'll teach you is hold this constant, and this will equal this. And those constants aren't real world practices. They're theories, right? In the real world, in theory, of course, I should buy 3 t-shirts for the price of 2. It makes absolutely no sense under any law for me not to do that. But in the real world, that extra t-shirt you got for that discount, the impact of that is horrendous to the animals, to the plants, to biodiversity, to ecosystem, to the 85% of animals that are extinct, species that are extinct in the world over the last 150 years or something like that, and ourselves, and all the diseases we have today that we have to contend with that are ridiculous. We can't do it with law. I don't think we can do it with law. We've been repeatedly shown that law doesn't work unless it aligns with our communal values. Recently, abortion, same thing. Abortion law didn't connect with values, and that's why you have all these botched abortions and people dying in abortion tables and stuff like that, because people are still going to do that now the law doesn't support them, so they're going to do it in underground places. And guess what's going to happen? You don't have that medical structure and infrastructure around you to save the person immediately if something goes wrong. They die.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely hear where you're coming from. And I want to clarify, when I brought up the ICJ ruling, I meant it more as like a way for us to focus our narrative rather than like that the international law would save us. Because I don't think international law, it doesn't have any teeth to it right now. I don't think it is going to save us. So I would agree with you there. I think that, at the end of the day, people, we have the same, vision and values in a sense. Like we want the people that we love and the places that we call home to be safe. We see this as a basic right. Right. And so, at the end of the day, I think that especially in the global north and in places that have been really commodified, in places where like this consumerist culture has really taken hold, we see consumerism taking the place of community in a lot of ways. And I think that is by design from, the industries that seek to profit from from folks here. And to sell their product, why have a friend drive you to the airport when you can have someone pick you up in an Uber? Like we've replaced community in a lot of senses with industry, right? And we now are growing up in generations where we don't, know that we can ask, industries to have, to produce products that we can use for decades. These industries have slowly shifted us into a very wasteful, kind of like an economy where our options are very limited to being very wasteful. It's hard to find a t-shirt at the store you can wear for 10 years, because they're so flimsy now. And so I think, calling people to kind of understand and have that culture shift of like, we can ask for more, from our government, we can ask for more from these industries. We have, the people have the power at the end of the day. We forget that because, we see that there's a lot of ways that we are sort of influenced to believe that we don't. But at the end of the day, like the majority of the people want our homes to be clean. We want our people that we love to be taken care of. We want to be safe, right? And so we share those values. And I think that the problem is these wealthy corporations and politicians are sacrificing our safety and our planetary viability for these short-term profits. And so the solution is, bringing people together in community, and showing people that that community can really fill that, gaping hole that the consumerist culture, tries to create. And that dismantling these profit-driven systems that are keeping climate change and the status quo, in the current reality, is possible, and that people can stand up and demand more and demand a system that puts people over profit, right?
Because we're the ones who are putting profit over ourselves. We're the consumers. We keep forgetting that. We keep saying profit-driven systems. And that's become a narrative. But the reality of it is, what is profit driven? I have to give you the money for you to profit as a corporation. If I'm not giving you the money, you have no profit driven system. And so, for example, we go out there and we blast Nestle and they make plastic bottles, are horrible for the environment, they're polluters. No, I am the polluter, you are the polluter. Why? Because we buy the plastic bottle at Walmart, we take it home, we drink it, we throw it in the garbage, and then we call them bad people for providing us a convenient service. If we really cared, we would go to Walmart and not buy the plastic bottle. Now you say, but we have no choice, Ali. Why? We can't afford the glass bottle. It's expensive. Or we can't afford the refilling systems and stuff. It's expensive. This is what we can afford. Okay, fine. You can't afford it. Go to your government, say, we're not buying this plastic bottle because it's not healthy, and we don't have an alternative because the healthy alternative is too expensive. You need to step in and subsidize health in the water system. Let's have that conversation going as policy. Let's bring in the corporation and say, hey, Nestle, come to the table as well. We're not attacking you, but what we want to do is we want to have a conversation and see if you were to move from plastic to glass, and your glass is $7 and your plastic is $2 and there's a $5 variance, and we can really only afford to pay $3 as a whole community. how can we get you from 7 to 3 on glass? Is it possible? Do you still make profit? And say, no, we won't. But we do still make profit at 5. We're willing to go down to 5. And then the government comes in and says, okay, fine, no problem. Between that 3 and 5, I'll fork out that $2 in subsidy. And now you have subsidization of something that helps everybody. But until the consumer doesn't raise that, why should Nestle care? Because Nestle's saying, I'm just feeding you what you want. You're asking me for this. You're never raised an issue. There's 5 Jamie Mindens who are raising an issue, but 95 out of the other 100 are not. So why is Nestle going to listen to you? They need to listen to the majority. That's their right. So I'm not going to misrepresent them. I'm going to say they're right. We are wrong. So that's where the culture shift needs to happen. The majority needs to start coming to this conversation, using the government that is purposed for us by our vote to our wants. You're supposed to implement our wants.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that, industries do have a lot of power, though, I will say, in like the goods that they produce and what we are able to consume. I was at COP in Dubai a couple of years ago, and I ended up having a conversation with someone who was in the petrochemical industry and in the fossil fuel industry, a lobbyist. I was really pressing them to try to understand their motives and try to get a better sense of what their long-term goals are. And this representative, she said that, she talked about how they in the industry, they see, in the fossil fuel industry, they see that, eventually fossil fuels will be phased out. And so she's blatantly said that their next goal was to increase demand for petrochemicals, for plastics, so that they can continue as a business. That's their business model, is they're doing everything they can to produce demand for their fossil fuel profits, for their plastics that are poisoning our communities. We see with, like, you brought up Nestle, that Nestle will, cause, communities will experience, let me say, like, impacts to their water supply, like in Flint, Michigan, for example, and have no choice but to buy bottled water, right? These industries are kind of forcing our hand in many ways. And that's not to say that the consumer doesn't have power over choice. Definitely we do. But I think it needs to be a larger conversation of not just, I think the climate movement has had a problem in the past of focusing too much on individual responsibility and not enough on collective action.
Exactly.
And I completely agree with you that we do have power in our pocketbooks. To some extent, but I also think that the industries are what we need to hold accountable, because at the end of the day, they are creating these policy decisions when all of the options, we as consumers have available to us are, like poison water or plastic water bottles, like in Flint, Michigan. I know that's not the case for everybody, but
I agree with you there. But let me ask you this. If we were to sum up in one word, what is the purpose of industry? I think we would agree that the purpose is profit.
Yes,
right?
Definitely.
Okay, great. So we're not agreeing that the purpose is some vile agenda. So Nestle is not out there with a purpose to poison. They're not like, let's see how many people we can poison, let's start a company. No, they're out there for profit. If we tell them, if they're making $1 of profit a day, right? And we tell them, you can keep your $1 of profit, but we want this product instead. They will shift.
Yeah.
I believe they will shift because they don't care, because they only care about the profit. I'm not asking Nestle to reduce their profit. I'm just asking Nestle to shift their production value in the same profit margin that they would be happy with as also humans living in the environment, knowing that it affects them too. I mean, the lobbyist still gets affected. The lobbyist may have lost her house in Malibu, for all you know, so they may get affected, right? Although, like you said, it's easier for them to transition. They'll just go to Chanel and replace their whole wardrobe in 5 minutes, but they still get affected. At the end of the day, we're all human. We all want to work together. These people are focused on profit. The global north wants capitalism. So if we're going to allow them capitalism and we want environmentalism, to bridge these two together is impossible. But the closest we can bring them is at least to tell them, we're willing to give you a segment of that profit and the government to step in and support this. However, we're going to stand strong and say, we're not buying this product anymore. But I think unless we do that, we're going to see this system that has worked forever. I mean, the same lobbyists who are doing this for plastics were doing it for cigarettes. Same companies, 2 decades ago, were working for cigarettes. 2 decades before that, for something else. And 2 decades after plastics is over, they're going to go into something else. They're always going to lobby because it's profitable. The cost of it is profitable. So we still hold the power, right? We hold industry accountable by our power, not by forcing, a legal mandate that everybody's kind of like stressed about versus everybody wanting it. And this is part of the division you're seeing in the United States now politically, because there's a lot of people with your mindset in the United States right now. There's a lot of people who have awakened to environmental issues, migration issues, injustice issues, racial issues, economic issues, the economic gap growing. And then there are other people who are like, no, this is the American way. We've always had these injustices. We've always had these grand issues. It's shoot to die. And, this is how I live. And I want that. And so, you have the MAGA wearer hat wearing, and you have the opposite. And it's become this dichotomy. But it will keep growing into a further violent dichotomy unless people can come together and say, there needs to be a middle ground where we can all thrive together. And I think that is a focus that is not missing, but it's not fully addressed in terms of bringing everybody on a round table, because there's so much trauma, there's so much pain, there's so much loss on the side that is really active right now, like your friend, down south in the rainforest. It's really difficult to bring them on a table and not have them be emotional and speak to, the petrochemical company taking over. So I think, if we can do that one day, and I think it's on youth organizations to come into the conversation saying, let's talk, and see where it gets there. Now, this was dense. So let me take you to a question where it's getting to know Jamie a little. Question. If you went away from this show right now and you said, oh my God, that was a headache and a half, that was really tense and deep and hard questions. And you said, I'm taking a sabbatical year off of all of this because of Ali. What would you do?
Let's see. Big question. I think there are sort of two answers. One of them is, unfortunately, and this is not exactly the answer you're looking for, I think, unfortunately, but given the impact of fascism in our country right now, I think if I weren't focusing on just, on climate, I would definitely throw myself as much as I could into community defense around immigration and ICE and the anti-fascist movement, which is something that Zero Hour is working on. Yes. Don't get me wrong, but I would love to spend more time doing community organizing around that issue. But the more fun answer, if we were living in a world that, where climate change wasn't an issue and folks were able to migrate freely, and we're seeing this fascist takeover of our country right now.
So this is the fantasy answer.
Yes, the fantasy is I am definitely a big animal lover, and I really I grew up going to the Monterey Bay a lot. I have grandparents that live there, and I used to volunteer at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. So I love oceans and animal species, and so I would love to do oceans research in the Monterey Bay. I think that would bring me a lot of joy. The tide pools there, if you ever get to visit, are beautiful.
I've been, and it is beautiful. Yeah. I like that. Okay, amazing. So you would work with animals in the ocean.
Yeah.
But not in aquariums. I don't like that part.
Sorry?
I don't like the part of the aquariums because I feel like, it's jailing them. So kind of like SeaWorld.
I see where you're coming from.
I don't want the SeaWorld effect. So no aquarium. Definitely so when you do that, when one day you do that as a side thing, please make sure the animals are still in the ocean and comfortable and have their free lives and everything else. Don't put them in aquariums.
Definitely.
Fair? Agreement? Okay.
Fair.
All right.
No, definitely. I think I'm more interested in how natural systems like kelp forests and marshes can be used to combat the climate crisis.
That is huge.
Also
that
just
is huge,
create more resilient ecosystems.
Yeah. The marshes,
so
we have that in Canada. We have so much of that. And you have that on the East Coast a lot, Louisiana and Florida and stuff. And we're not tapping into that education at all. But I'm not going to go into that. But that was a great point you brought up. There's so much that people aren't really aware of in terms of what we have at our disposal and what we're not using. So yes, go do the ocean stuff and do that research because that will help Now, let me ask you this. If you, this is something like, if you had all the money in the world and Jeff Bezos knocked on your door, but never mind the Jeff Bezos part, if you were the most influential person in the world right now, in one sentence, what is the first action you take to ignite a global shift to that, the fantasy we just talked about, social harmony, essentially? If you had that as the end goal in one quick sentence, what is that? How do you do that?
That
Yes.
is difficult.
Yeah, it is. It
One
is.
sentence.
Yeah, no long
Uh,
essays, nothing. Short story, one sentence story.
Short story.
Mm.
Whew.
They give out
Um,
awards on those. I have a friend of mine, Tadpole Publishing,
yeah.
Amber Byers. She has an award,
Mhm.
a 10-sentence story. Sorry, 10-word story.
Mhm.
It's one sentence, 10 words, and they
Story.
have to tell a whole story. And, when you read those, you're amazed. You're like, wow, it is a story. I could never do that. That 10 words would be like 5 pages for me. So I hear your pain on that. But give me a sentence.
Yeah.
What would you do?
Yeah. Well, to keep it as short as possible, I would
Okay.
say people over profit, But to expand on that, ending the production of fossil fuels globally and the global north paying their fair share to ensure a just transition, ending global occupations conflict such as the occupation of Gaza and the mineral conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Um, and we, at the end of the day, what we really need is a global system that puts people first and doesn't demand endless profit and extraction that is unrealistic to the boundaries of our planet. Like right now, our economic system isn't realistic about our planetary boundaries, and we need to change that. We have the money, the technology to solve the climate crisis right now. What we really need is the political will, and that is an achievable goal, right? The climate crisis is urgent and solvable, and we need mass collective action from the people, from the ground up, to solve the climate crisis and to hold our world leaders accountable. And I am a radical optimist, and I believe that we can do that. And so, yeah. And then I guess, to tack a little on the end there, in that vision, we need to have a system where people have the right to migrate. People have the right to a clean and healthy future that is safe for their families. We have racial and economic justice. We have justice and land back for indigenous peoples. That is a key part of this, integrated solution.
And what you just said can be summed up actually with a system that, again, TBI, transformation by investment over return on investment, and as a social order, a compassion model, whether as an economic order, compassion economics, or as a social order, a compassion model. So going back to Compassiviste and tying it into that, essentially, yes, we need that compassivist social order because it's compassion in action. Compassion itself as an emotion doesn't do much. I mean, you and I can sit here and talk about people in the global south and be angry and sip our coffees and be like, it shouldn't be this way, and then go watch TV afterwards. Nothing's going to change. It's when we actually put that in action that things start to change, right? When 0 hour comes to birth and you have a full-time job making a difference, and then it starts looking like things are happening. So yes, we need to radically increase compassion so that it becomes people over profit, because the only time you care about people over profit, or you prioritize people or life in general, animals and all of that, and you'll never be able to prioritize people over profit if you don't take into the account the whole ecosystem. Because if you prioritize people and not the animals, you'll never prioritize anything over profit, because the animals still serve profit, and then you still fall into the problems of eco issues, right? So, you have factory farming, you're not going to solve the climate issue. So, you can't put people over profit. You can put life over profit. And then at that point,
Life, yeah.
yeah, at that point, you reach that goal that you're stating. So I like your answer. It's like fully aligned to you just said compassivist in many other words, so it's great. Now, last question before I let you go. I want to obviously this airs and it's going to live somewhere in some cloud for the rest of eternity, so this I'm going to haunt you with in 10 years. I'm going to come back in 10 years and I'm going to say, Jamie, this is what you said. So either it's going to be like, wow, I'm impressed, or it's going to be like, so either way, what will success look like for you personally, and then for Zero Hour in 10 years? So 2035, and we hit the 3 degrees marker, and we're all depressed because we did, looking at it the way it is now. But we're going to stay radically hopeful, like you said, and think that we won't. Where do you see yourself?
Yeah, great question. I mean, maybe this is a marker of how much I need more of a work-life balance. But I see, my personal success as, doing what has guided me in my career and in my life path so far, and has been, trying to make decisions professionally that will have the biggest impact on our climate, whatever that looks like. So, that led me to move from California to DC for school to try to influence national policy. That led me to work at Zero Hour because I saw this as being a place where I could have the biggest impact on international policy as a young person.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of my, I guess, in terms of what, my personal success is, having the biggest impact I can on the climate crisis as possible. Goes back to that night I was 14, laying awake in my bed, thinking about what I can do in the next 10 years, right? So that will likely stay my mission 10 years out. And for Zero Hour, I mean, as I kind of mentioned, our campaigns are really structured around global justice issues and having a biggest impact as possible on the fossil fuel industries and the climate crisis, right? And so success for our campaigns looks like, ending the build out of the liquefied natural gas crisis and that industry that is poisoning these communities and is, would cause rapid expansion of the climate crisis globally. So ending the liquefied natural gas industries build out and, shutting down the factories of fossil fuel expansion and shifting to a clean energy economy in a way that is just, retraining those fossil fuel employees, bringing folks along in a just transition is a really big one. And a key part of that is our other campaign around fossil fuel subsidies. So, ending the now almost $40 billion yearly in the United States of fossil fuel subsidies and handouts coming from our tax dollars in our pockets, and seeing how big of an impact that has on stopping the fossil fuel industry, and seeing what we can reinvest that money into, into our communities, into clean energy, into healthcare. And so that part of a just transition is really important for us too. Definitely fair shares climate reparations would be a big goal. Part of the United States is like nationally determined contribution is not only 80% of emissions reduction by 2035 to stay below 1.5. That's only half the battle. The other half the battle is the economic investment that we owe to countries that have not been, releasing these fossil fuels like we have, but are experiencing the impacts. And so, ensuring that the United States and other wealthy nations that have invested in fossil fuels pay their fair share in order to move the world along into a just transition on off of fossil fuels. So if that vision is achieved, I see a future where thousands, if not, maybe even millions of lives are saved if we are able to keep global warming at or below 1.5 degrees of global climate, global temperature increase. We see a world where maybe we're not devoid of climate impacts, but we start investing in mitigation and adaptation. We start investing in communities. We use that money that is lining the pockets of these billionaires that are, destroying our planet right now. And we take that money and we give it to the people. And we give it to we're restoring these ecosystems that are so vital for our planetary health. And so that is my very radically optimistic vision of what could happen 10 years ahead. And, it is not, yes, it's radically optimistic given the current world order right now, but it is not radically optimistic given the technology and the money that we have available. At the end of the day, it's a matter of people power. It really is.
It's realistic. It's just a matter of, like you said, shifting that. What I keep coming back to is shifting the mindset, right? If we can,
Absolutely.
what seems to be, a myth or a fantasy or a fable is the mindset shift. Everything else is there. Like you said, we have the tech, we have the money, we have the
Anything else
government settings, we have everything we need to live
we
harmoniously.
do?
The only thing we don't
We
have
do.
is a logical human being.
Yes.
You know,
Yes. Or a logical human being in
yeah,
power.
and then but we put the illogical human being in power, so we ourselves have to be illogical to do that, right? So when people say, "But we have a bad government," I say, "Wait a minute, aren't you a voting public? Like, did you not put that person there or that whole Congress there?" Well, it is what it is. It's us. So we need a whole bunch of more sane people on this planet. So I hope the next generation that is born, has their head screwed on much better than my generation or the one before me. That really is the grandfather of this situation. So yeah, amen to that, Jamie. Jamie Minden, thank you for speaking on Compassiviste Dialogues, and thank you for embodying the urgency and clarity that this moment demands. You keep coming back to it, and I love that you do. Your work within Zero Hour and the work of the organization as a whole is not about empty hope or optics. It's about turning youth momentum into concrete, scalable change. So as you've demonstrated, when young leaders are given structure, resources, and trust, they don't just raise their voices and have marches and stuff for no reason. They actually move the needle on the future of our planet, like you have personally and you have institutionally now done so. So to our audience, the reason you need to subscribe to Compassiviste Dialogues channel and share these episodes is not so I become famous. It's so that we can share more of what great organizations like Zero Hour are doing and be involved with them. That is the purpose of Compassiviste Dialogues, is to involve people with these spaces so that we can showcase Jamie's work, as an organization and say, okay, Jamie, we're here. We're the public. We're here. What do you need? Here's 2,000 new people coming to you. What do you need? And that's what really moves the needle for Zero Hour, which moves the needle for the world. So if you want to keep that below 1.5, this is a place you go to. You go to Jamie and say, what can we do? And I'm sure Jamie will have an array of things and place you somewhere that you can be productive and influential to that support. So that's why you need to share these things. That's why you need to follow the right spaces on social media and follow the right people and be in the conversation that leads you in those directions. We're putting all the links to Zero Hour, Jamie, and information about every way you can connect with them and reach with them and support and be a part of it and join and advocate and whatever else great things you can do with Zero Hour and Compassiviste down below. So get in touch with them. We're here to help change the world together. I'm Ali Horia.